The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules and joining us here in our LightFair post-game show webinar. I am Armando, the Technical Development Supervisor at the Light and Design Lab. Joining me will be Melanie Danuser, the Director of Education and Training at the Smart Business Center. Also, we're having Shaun and Eric Strandberg, our professional lighting specialist at the lab, and Irina Rasputnis, our fearless leader, executive director, overseeing everything that's going to be going well. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping notes. Everyone right now is going to be muted. This webinar is going to be recorded and posted on our website at the Light and Design Lab. Wanted to also know, if you guys have any questions at any time, please feel free to write them on the chat panel. We may get to them during the presentation, and if we don't, we will have a session for questions after the fact. And even if we don't get to your question and you want to keep interacting with us, please reach out, and we would love to communicate with you offline. So for now, just sit back and enjoy the show. Wanted to start by noting, hey, we're going to just talk a little bit about the Light and Design Lab and the Smart Business Center. We're going to go over some of the offerings and seminars that LightFair was featuring, some very interesting things. We're going to show you what some of the things that we learned. From those things that we learned, we noticed there are specific trends that LightFair was showing out this year. We'll be going over a few of those as well. We're going to put our take on the Innovation Awards. And then we're going to really let you know what we really enjoyed seeing. Lastly, I'm going to briefly mention how the Light and Design Lab is engaging industry at this time. So who is the Light and Design Lab? First and foremost, I wanted to say that we are owned and operated by Seattle City Light. We're also supported by utility industry allies and industry manufacturers and actors. The Light and Design Lab provides 4 core business service areas, such as technology, evaluation and demonstrations, education and training. If you guys know of our famous 1-day and 2-day NLC courses, we develop tools and resources, and we aggregate information and disseminate it to our audiences, such as this perfect example right now. Wanted to take a moment to also shout out and thank our utility industry allies, people that we work in the Pacific Northwest region and the surrounding regions beyond. Right now, I'm going to hand this off to Melanie Danuser. She's going to be introducing the Smart Business Center.
Good morning. This is Melanie Danuser, and thank you, Armando. I want to talk to you a little bit today, though, about the Smart Buildings Center. Business is part of what we do, so I wanted to introduce our mission, vision, and how we accomplish those. What the Smart Buildings Center wants to do is make smart buildings, technologies, and practices more accessible and able to be integrated and implemented into existing buildings and new construction. Our vision, what we see, is a future where buildings contribute to solutions for the larger environment and their occupants. And how we accomplish that is through training, demonstration, and events. And I'll go into a little more detail here on 2 of our flagship programs that the Smart Buildings Center runs. The Building Operator Certification Program has been around for over 20 years. It is a training and credentialing program for operators and engineers in commercial and multifamily and industrial facilities. What we accomplish is we want our graduates to leave the training with skills and knowledge to make their facilities more comfortable, efficient, and environmentally friendly. The BOC credential is valuable not only to those who earn it, but also to their employers and to the occupants who get to work and live in spaces that are more efficient, systems are running optimally, and reducing the carbon footprint of those buildings. And an outcome of those skills and knowledge that our graduates earn, of course, is bottom line energy savings. So the facilities that our operators work in will see energy savings through projects that they implement and learn about in the BOC program. The Smart Building Center also offers the Tool Lending Library. It is a library of diagnostic tools available to anyone in the states of Washington and Oregon, free of charge. It's a really, really cool resource. If you haven't checked it out yet, come up and see us if you can. We're in Seattle on Beacon Hill in the Pacific Tower. If you can't, we have a very robust online system where you can view the tools, learn about the tools, interact. We actually have a dedicated staff member, our tool lending librarian, who's available to answer questions. If you can't make it in to pick up a tool, we will ship it to you. You're responsible to get it back to us. So if you're considering perhaps an energy savings project, or you're just interested in a new trend or technology, we might have some tools to assist you with that. Again, it's free of charge. We have everything online. We have our contact information. Melissa is our tool lending library manager, and we really feel like coupling the tool lending library with some of the other training and education that we offer, including the building operator certification program and opportunities just like today, will help the Smart Building Center move our mission and vision forward as far as adopting and accelerating the adoption of these technologies and practices. I'll go ahead now and turn it over to Shaun Dara with the Lighting Design Lab.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm Shaun Dara. I am a senior lighting specialist here at the Lighting Design Lab. About a month ago or so, we sent around a notice talking about this whole upcoming LightFair trip and some of the things that we were particularly going to be looking to bring back to the Pacific Northwest here. Really, we were focusing on things like horticultural lighting. How much kind of technology and learning could we find about that? Things to do with light and health with respect to, say, color tuning and so forth. And also a whole bunch about interoperability, power over Ethernet, DC lighting grid fixtures, color tunable lighting, which gives us the intersection of light and health and lighting controls. So we kind of took this on as our mission. And the first part of that mission becomes the idea of the courses. So at LightFair, of course, there are lots of classes that are offered. Eric Strandberg will talk a little bit about them, but let me give you a quick bit of an overview about some of the things that we found. Much like last year, and perhaps the year before, we found that there was a whole lot of interest in particular, lighting controls and light and health. So for a controls geek like me, this was terrific, right? And I'm also really interested, particularly as a lighting designer, in everything that we can learn and bring back to the Pacific Northwest and our various stakeholders to bring back this information about that intersection of light and health and controls and so forth. So if we look at the screen here, you get a little bit of a sense. Everything that is projected in yellow is predominantly lighting controls based. Everything that's projected in green is predominantly light and health based. And then you see that there's a significant intersection between the two. This is on the left, the two-day LightFair Institute. And on the right, it was the first day of the actual classes. If we skip forward to the next page, we actually see that we have days 2 and 3 there. So you get a sense that there is a great deal of interest continuing within the industry, and I dare say within the general community, within the design community, as well as the people who use our buildings for these kind of spaces. Now, I will tell you that it was a great deal of fun for me anyway, to go ahead and teach our flagship two-day advanced network lighting controls class at LightFair. We had a terrific time, 29 great attendees who had, I think, a really good time learning a whole lot of stuff, and in particular, spending a lot of time with hands-on equipment, hands-on demonstrations, and really kind of talking through a lot of issues, really fundamentally trying to make sure that the people that walked away had a certain level of confidence with respect to lighting controls, but more than anything, no longer had any kind of fear of them. The lighting controls are really quite fundamental to what we do these days. And in particular, we see a fellow there named Armando who stepped up and actually helped through several of the programming rotations when one of our manufacturer partners had a little bit of difficulty. So it was a great effort, a lot of great stuff going on there. If you are interested in these classes, both, as Armando had mentioned, the 1 and the 2-day network lighting controls classes, we're done with them for the spring, but they'll be coming back in the fall. We'll be teaching a 2-day definitely in Seattle, and likely to be adding additional 1 and 2 days throughout the region. So all those things are available. Go ahead and take a look at our webpage, lightingdesignlab.com, a little bit later in the summer for more information about that. So with all of that said, it was a fantastic time, a lot of different great classes, and Eric Strandberg is actually going to go ahead and give you some details of a couple of the classes that he attended. So without further ado, Eric.
Thanks, Shaun. And yeah, that 2-day workshop controls workshop is really good. I've sat through it a few times. As far as LightFair offerings, see if we can go in the right direction. There we go. You know, it's always a mix between attending lots of seminars that are really interesting and getting out on the floor and seeing lots of new product that's really interesting. So I tried to do a little of both. One thing that we've been hearing a lot about is blue light, particularly as they relate to LEDs and the effects they have. And I'm just going to say this particular presentation kind of blew my mind in that it was presented by 3 PhDs at the University of Washington. And they were saying that blue and orange contrast is as much as 100 times more powerful a stimulus compared to blue light alone. Now, I'm not going to try and defend that or explain it. I just think that this shows that there's so much we really don't know and so much we're continuing to learn about this dynamic field of light and health. So we're, as a sidebar, we're going to try to get that presentation, the IES local chapter is going to try and get that presentation here to Seattle. Another presentation I thought that was interesting was moving beyond color metrics for the 21st century lighting. It was kind of touching on the new IES TM30-18 and just running down a few things, quick facts about color and vision. The class went in a lot of depth, but I thought it was interesting that changes in light level can affect our perception of saturation, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. There was color changes as we change our perspective. I think we've known this intuitively, but different people perceive color differently. Our color perception changes with age, and it's also color perception is metameric, meaning that you can have two apparent colors that look the same, but depending on their spectral power distribution, they may actually reveal other colors differently. I thought this little graphic was interesting. The red dotted line shows the average perception, and then they had 12 subjects, and you can see the differences. Moving on, Not a lot to say about what's next in energy codes. This was primarily Title 24 and ASHRAE 90.1. Basically, they're going down. How low can you go was a takeaway. But controls versus lighting power density is going to be the watchword there. Horticulture lighting for industrial applications, what really matters. I think that one of the things they saw was that LED lighting compared to conventional high intensity discharge, we see lots of features, more intensity, optimized spectrum, better uniformity of the light throughout the space, the growing environment, and lots of energy savings. The utilities have known that. We see a longer longevity, less maintenance, and then of course there's no mercury involved. Another thing, of course, that they talked about is that light is just one aspect of a rather complex factor when it comes to plant growth. And then finally, the hunt effect, lighting to counteract the hunt effect. What is it? Well, it turns out that high intensity, especially high brightness light, daylight, we get a nice saturation. As we dim the electric lighting, saturation of color decreases. So one thing that they were finding is, again, as it relates back to TM30, when we have increased chroma, people generally prefer a higher chroma, but that may be due to the fact that interior light levels are generally low compared to daylight. At this point, I think I'm going to pass it on to Armando, and we can take it from there.
Thank you very much, Eric. I also attended a session on Li-Fi or light fidelity. Quick tidbit on it. In a nutshell, on high level, not very different from a wireless router, but using visual light, you would be able to transmit and receive data that, as long as you are under or being illuminated by the visual light, you will be able to, again, transmit, receive data very similarly to a wireless Wi-Fi router. Some of the key notes were mentioned. Hey, the components are not very expensive to source, and the opportunities huge. There are security implications. There's possibilities of communications between vehicles, the vehicle-to-vehicle communication, outdoor light communications. So good amount of opportunity with this technology. One of the great graphics that we saw was a timeline that the professionals were presenting to us, where the early adopters of this technology is the U.S. military, purely for the security purposes of, hey, if you are not in the room where the lights are shining, you are not communicating in that network. And as we see going forward, there's going to be more industrial applications, chipsets, outdoor and vehicle applications. So definitely a technology to be on the lookout for. Even some of the manufacturers on the floor, such as Signify, were already having demonstrations in their booths of how they're applying this technology and wanting to launching them in the very near future. Before I go on and talk about the interoperability trend that we saw at LightFair, I want to mention that we noticed that few people are having audio issues. Maybe a network connection issue, but if you continue to have these problems with hearing, the sound is not correct, you may dial in by phone, could have better luck there. And as a last resort, again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available through our websites. So interoperability and Internet of Things, IoT, pretty much the majority of the booths that we saw with different lighting manufacturers, they all had, the majority did have a solid communications technology display, IoT, and this is the wave of the future, in my opinion. Wanted to also like mention, what are the protocols of this communication? Bluetooth is making huge waves, allowing IoT devices to communicate between each other, be it Bluetooth low energy or in a mesh network, especially because it's an open protocol where if multiple systems from separate vendors are using this such protocol, they'll be able to communicate with each other, specifically doing different things like, hey, AV and lighting and so on and so forth. So again, the wave of the future. Did attend a session by what we call the Zaga Consortium. Not familiar with Zaga. I actually learned about them myself very recently. There used to be a standard setting organization that worked on the LED components, interfaces, drives, standardizing the form factors and some of the mechanical, electrical specs. Now they have slightly rebranded and calling themselves the new Zaga Consortium. Still similar philosophy, but they're now going to be focusing on standardizing interoperable components. The way I saw it, as it was explained, I call it, hey, the USB of lighting. So focusing first on the outdoor luminaires, you're going to be standardizing how different vendors can interface components such as smart sensors, smart nodes, smart devices with similar form factors and plugs and connections, where no matter what luminaire and vendor are going to be interested in a project, the idea is that IoT features will be able to be implemented. So watch out by this this new certification coming out Q3 2019 in a collaboration between the Zaga Consortium and the DIIA, another standards organization from Europe, calling it the ZDI4. So very recently, Tuesday, I was in a conversation on, hey, who in these new smart buildings, who is going to own the ceiling? In terms of, we want to talk about non-energy benefits. What I mean by that is, hey, yes, when we talk about all these lighting and lighting control, new technologies, we focus a lot on saving energy, dimming light, turning light off. But now there's an entire new value propositions that these buildings are getting smarter, where there are vendors that on themselves, they'll do space utilization technology, they'll do asset tracking technology. And these vendors will have their own infrastructure, their own cameras, their own sensors, and own dashboards. So what the lighting industry is noticing is, hey, we have power in the ceiling. We have smart devices in the ceiling. We're already going to be there. We want to leverage these devices to add the value proposition. So we don't want to have a building have multiple infrastructures and vendors. We can consolidate, streamline this process. And that is exactly what we saw at LightFair 2019. Different manufacturers showcasing how they are implementing your asset tracking technology, space utilization, dashboarding, energy monitoring, so on and so forth. Another trend that I started seeing that I actually am very excited about in supporting is the project planning and design. Few manufacturers were showcasing how you can they can work with you on laying out your systems, on planning the systems in a unified way to make it easier for implementers of these systems to have a bill of materials, to have your sequence of operations, your graphical representation of a space. And another technology such as estimating project cost, that Quest D by Lutron, where you input a few variables such as square footage of a building, a high level, what's existing, and you'll have an estimated, depending on the features that you want, you'll have an estimated project cost and timeline. So again, as these manufacturers are assisting the trade allies on how to develop these projects, the more these will get implemented. So very excited to see how this continues to develop. Right now, I'm going to pass it on to Shaun, as he's going to be talking about the light and health trends in LightFair.
Hey, everybody. Back to me. So before I get going, let me just toss out a bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, please go ahead and submit them through the app. Irina and Melanie are monitoring those, and we will look at them and address them at the end of the talk. So we've talked a little bit about some of the classes that have been available and some of the hardware, particularly with respect to lighting controls. It'll probably surprise no one to hear that Light and Health, particularly with respect to LED technology, has come back full front, particularly with some of the research papers that have been reported out of France and others with respect to blue light. I'm not going to get too much into that necessarily today, except to say that this is something that's being taken very seriously. How do we start to think about that? Well, of course, a third of all the classes at LightFair had some kind of bearing on how we do some of these things. My favorite class, actually, that I took was put on by Naomi Miller and Steve Paolini. It'll surprise no one to know that Naomi is a fantastic speaker. They had put together this really interesting array of color tunable, not just tunable white, but color tunable light fixtures, and did a really, really interesting display about spectral power distribution. And in particular, this kind of comes back to a little bit of what Eric was talking about earlier with the Hunt effect, and the idea that daylight in particular is not quite, from a spectral characteristic standpoint, the way that we may always think about it. It's even on relatively warm sunset afternoons, there's still a lot of blue, there's still a lot of wide spectrum light within there. So there's some really interesting hands-on kind of looks here. But at the bottom line, what we're really talking about these days is got less to do with color temperature, less to do with color rendering index, and more to do with the actual spectral power distribution of the light sources. This is what's really important. And for my money, we've spent a lot of time in the last 10, 12 years talking about efficacy, and the industry is really kind of spinning that back around and pushing right back into the whole notion of quality of light. And quality of light fundamentally is all about first, that spectral power distribution. It's also how we design with spaces, and we put light where we want it to be. So we're emphasizing light. Sometimes we're emphasizing dark when that's appropriate. And we're also emphasizing controllability. So again, it's this intersection of quality of light, spectral power distribution, interoperability of systems. All of these things come together. Now, the popular press is talking an awful lot about blue light within the LED spectrum. The reality is blue light's in daylight too. So this is a longer discussion we're not going to have right now, but suffice to say that look into some of the research that's going on. So how does this all sort of start to become practical? If we go ahead and we look, almost every booth that I saw at LightFair, almost every single booth had some kind of nod to circadian entrainment, and in particular, the whole notion of tunable white. So we saw lots and lots, even simple things like, in this case from Prudential Lighting, we have very simple sort of essentially strip lights. They're color tunable. There were systems that would allow you to tie these into larger network systems. Some manufacturers actually had systems that would go ahead and allow you to just do room-by-room control. But ultimately, this all needs to kind of tie back to the research that's going on. And this is why we attend these classes, right? If we're talking about circadian entrainment, the initial thoughts were that it had to do almost exclusively with blue light within the spectrum. But we're learning now that it has more to do with the spectrum, but also the intensity of the light stimulation, the duration of the light stimulation, the timing of the light stimulation, and even the directionality of the light stimulation. So there's a lot to be learned here that really goes beyond just being able to press a button and have the light go from 2700 Kelvin to 3500 Kelvin to 6700 Kelvin. So the other key thing here is that the IES and the UL are in a little bit of a tussle. UL has put out UL RP 24480, promoting circadian entrainment with light for day active people. This is something that they've never actually done before. And it's raising some interesting questions because UL is not a consensus-based ANSI group as IES is. Another big part of that is the question that keeps coming up at these conferences: have we gone too far in driving the light levels down within our spaces? Are we underlighting the daytime world? This has some serious implications for energy codes in particular, but that's a discussion for a different day. But again, as I mentioned, basically everybody is talking about tunable color and tunable white. Real question moving forward is whether we're going to continue with the blue pump phosphor boards, or a number of people are really pushing the idea of narrow band emitter chip packages. In fact, Nichia won an award for one that Eric will talk about. So it's not going to be very long, I think, in my opinion, before we start to see that most luminaires come as standard with tunable white within them, right? This is not terribly dissimilar to the change between non-dimmable and 0 to 10 volt dimmable that we've seen, where everything is now 0 to 10 volt dimmable, right? And that really helps us to emphasize some of the non-energy benefits that Armando was talking about. Now, one of the key other parts of this with respect to tying all these things together is the idea of light and health and Internet of Things. So we're seeing between the mergers and acquisitions and also the in-house R&D, we're seeing most companies are now really either purchasing companies that have IoT capability, being purchased by companies that have IoT capability, or trying to develop it in-house. So one way or another, the three-letter acronym that we're all going to hear about in the not terribly distant future is Application Programming Interface. This is going to be a big, big, big thing moving forward. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Eric to talk about the Innovation Award winners and hear some of the things that the LightFair judges thought were really important. Eric, take it away.
Thanks, Shaun. And per that, I guess it's maybe is worth mentioning. LightFair is I think they're in almost their 30th year.
This is 30.
Yeah, their 30th year. It's it's a big industry trade show, and it's a way for manufacturers and other industry people interested in lighting to get together and see what's new, look at product, network, and additionally, there's just tons of classes and seminars that they have during the show, and then they have as Shaun mentioned, a pre-show event where they have 2 days of workshops. So it's a great way to learn and get up to speed about what's new and different, and they move it around from city to city. As far as the awards go. It's interesting. They have different categories of products, probably 12 or 13 different categories. I can't remember them all off the top of my head. And then there's a volunteer group of judges from the industry who talk about what products excelled in those different categories. And then out of those categories, they pick products that they felt would win a show award, were particularly innovative, and so that's kind of how this particular piece came about. So the most innovative product for the show this year was by a company called EcoSense. It's a product called Lore. They just picked, that's the name of it. And it's, it's an optical and controls module. It's kind of all built into one. And I guess this gets back to what I was noticing is, these various product categories are starting to merge more and more. It used to be you'd have a manufacturer that made light sources. You'd have another manufacturer that made controls. You'd have a different manufacturer that made luminaires. And they were all kind of separate silos, separate worlds, and now we're finding that all of this stuff is getting baked into individual products, and this is a great example of that. So this is in the true interest of plug and play. This product is able to just go into a light fixture. In this case, they make a series of recessed cans pendant, downlights, and surface mount product. And with their EcoSense Lingo digital platform, it can talk to Dolly, it can talk to DMX, 0 to 10, or even electronic low voltage. So easy way to adapt these products over a wide range of platforms. Another product by Peerless, which is an Acuity brand, won a Design Excellence Award, the RENA. It's in this particular picture that you're looking at, it's kind of interesting. They're taking, one of the things that's happened with LED is we don't have to have things in straight lines necessarily. We don't have to have them in little boxes. And so we're seeing all these amazing form factors. And so what we've got here is a twist, if you will, on the lighting form factor. And this product also can do 90-degree angles, radiuses, all kinds of configurations. It can do asymmetric wall washing. It's just a really versatile tool. There were actually 2 Judges Citation Awards for very similar products. I think the reason they gave out 2 is because these 2 products, this is a Nietzsche product Shaun alluded to earlier, and then I'm just going to bounce over to the Samsung product. You can see they're very similar. So color tunable, chip on board, lighting modules, lighting packages, and one of the things I think that's different about these 2, because we've seen color tunable chips before, is they've integrated them into a grid pattern such that you get a really uniform, you don't get striations, and it's a uniform patterning that you would get. This is the Samsung E-Series product. Okay, so this kind of blew my mind. It's time for a new light source. If you're tired of the same old LEDs, SLD Laser has a product. They think laser light is the solution. So, right, I mean, we're just now catching our breath with LEDs, and something new's come along. They're making claims, I think they're a little bit sort of headline type claims, but, more luminance, tighter beam angle, farther distance potentially, and better contrasts. So, seismic shift. But this is the product. It won a Technical Innovation Award. It's about the size of in this case, a little D battery, a D cell. And they use a laser. And you can get 2-degree beams. And people who've been doing lighting know that even a 10-degree beam is a pretty tight beam. We're seeing specialty product that can go 5 degrees or so. 2-degree beam means you have a very narrow beam. And it's white light. It's, they're still working a little bit. I think the color rendering is about 70, which is for many applications is fine. But instead of using an LED to energize the phosphors, they use a laser. And they won an innovation award last year with a similar product. And this is just carrying on from that. If you go to their website, they've got a really interesting little video of someone in a helicopter flying around, and they're just using a couple of these little modules, and they're lighting up billboards and all kinds of things. So again, I think it's one of those cases where once this product's out in the marketplace, people find interesting ways to adapt it and utilize it. Moving on, so those were the award winners. Moving on to some of the staff favorites. A couple things I saw that I thought were particularly cool, and in fact, in my notes, I wrote a little note that said, "This is cool." When they were introducing it during the Innovation Awards, it didn't seem like much. It's basically a little adjustable module downlight. And I'm thinking, okay, we've seen that before. But what's really happening is they take the tiny LED, which is just a point source, and instead of a gimbal or tilting the light source, they're just moving that little point source around in the optical reflector. And that is what makes the beam shift around and move around. It's pretty uncanny. So I think we may be starting to see more of this kind of thing. Glenn came out of doing sun light gathering with solar panels and skylights. So watch for them. Another thing I thought was this by the Lumadapt 8 by Ephesus, an Eaton company. I just thought it looked great. I mean, look at that thing, right? But this is used for stadium lighting, arenas. It does a few things that are particularly interesting. Other than all the color changing, color tuning, it does this thing called beam tuning, right? So you can go from a flood when you're maybe doing your introductions, and once the game starts or some sort of event begins, you can focus it all to a narrower beam, very dramatic. Additionally, you know, we're looking at high definition broadcasts, and slow motion is a big deal when it comes to replays and things like that. And so this is a particularly well adapted for high definition and even 4K and 8K broadcasts with no flicker or strobing. So anyway, just seeing interesting things. I think Shaun had a couple of things. I'm going to pass the mic over to him.
Thank you, Eric. So it may come as no surprise that being a controls geek, one of the best things that I found about LightFair is the proliferation or the continued proliferation of lighting controls manufacturers and ever better equipment, ever better gear. One of the key things, however, for me is that I'm starting to see that we're pushing back into digital communications for a lot of controls. I'm very excited to see what happens with DALI 2 in particular, because as grateful as I am about 0 to 10 volt actually giving us dimming for everything again, I'd really like to see us get back into the world of bidirectional communication and more information sharing. So from a lighting standpoint, what I'm usually looking for at LightFair is things that I haven't seen before. Now, the image on the left is a little bit tongue-in-cheek because it's really just essentially rope light. But what I'm really looking for is always things that are new or things that potentially now can't have been done with fluorescent and so forth. So one of the key things that I like to see is that, particularly for contract interiors stuff, decorative gear, we wind up now seeing a lot of lighting that is dedicated LED equipment. For many, many years, we had the problem of having to have socket-based LED gear. Now, in particular, also the profusion of wood and wood finishes on gear. I really like that. The image on the right from WAC lighting there, I like very much because it's really deconstructed. If you look at it, it's essentially a deconstructed look at what a fluorescent pendant might have been. At any angle but from directly below, you see right through it because there's literally nothing there, just a glowing panel on the bottom. My favorite pick actually was this product. There are other products like this in the past that have allowed you to incise LED lighting into 5/8 inch chip. But this is the first one that I've seen that actually both allowed you to do radius curves instead of just mitered corners, and it also has surface and suspended modules where you can actually fly away from the jib surface as well. So this gave a little bit of playfulness and was really kind of, from a lighting standpoint, my favorite on the staff. So next up, we go back to Armando.
Thank you, Shaun. And as Shaun mentioned, I myself am also a controls geek. Good amount of systems and products that I saw were amazing. One that really stood out for me was Signify's Interact series, where they have different specific systems depending if your space type is a landmark, an office, a retail space, industrial site. But ultimately, what Interact means is they've really heavily invested in the IT and the non-energy benefits that lighting control systems can provide for you. That's your lighting management, your measuring energy, scene and space management and utilization, asset tracking, indoor positioning. The list goes on, and they've really encompassed a good amount of these possible non-energy benefits into this series of systems. So good to see that, hey, if this is where the trend, this is where the industry is heading, going to be a very enjoyable time in the future as everything is connected. However, that being said, I had a note in the fine print of our table of content slide. When we mention companies and products, we are not directly endorsing them, but it is more so for demonstration purposes as we are talking about these emerging technologies. Wanted to briefly mention Lighting Design Lab is further engaging industry manufacturers and allies. We have, as we've mentioned, for our 1- and 2-day network lighting control courses, working already with existing manufacturers. What we have been looking to do is to formalize these relationships, continue a collaborative work, and as we have plans for the future, we're further discussing more collaboration in the field. What we heard from these conversations that we've had in LightFair and afterwards, hey, we do have a good amount of support for industry. There is a good desire to support the lab, and that our 4 core services are much needed to advance the adoption of these network lighting control systems, good LED technologies, and so on and so forth. So wanted to finalize by saying, even if we had a team of about 50 people, we probably could have gotten to 1/3 or 1/4 of everything LightFair had to offer. So this is our LightFair webinar through the Light and Design Lab's eyes. Thank you again for the Smart Building Center to host the webinar here in your space. Wanted to open the floor for any questions that have come in. Thank you very much from everyone here. So if there are questions, there are buttons you can press for raising your hand, chatting it in, typing it in. So we do have a question from Tony Cock in BPA. I'm actually going to hand this over to Shaun, as he may have more of a, now that seeing the question, he may have more of a solid insight at this topic than I would.
So Tony's question, why are exterior LED lights, mostly street lighting, so unpleasant to look at? They are bright sources of light. They need to be lensed and diffused. So not being a manufacturer of these products, I don't necessarily want to talk too much about that. I can tell you that from my own perspective, the key things with respect to exterior LED lighting or in any exterior lighting have to do with things like trying to keep the light level down, trying to keep the glare down from the light fixtures, trying to go ahead and aim the light where we want it to be. So in other words, we're not trying to get light at very high angles so that we're not going ahead and either getting glare in people's eyes or scattering through the atmosphere, leading to sky glow, things like that. So I would say that the baseline is that the early products for LED street lighting were really trying to emphasize efficacy over pretty much everything else to be able to make the value proposition work best for them. So I think as we're moving ahead, the industry as a whole is coming about with some ideas that, again, quality is much more important and the whole emphasis on light and health, particularly circadian entrainment and light stimulation at night, are going to be big elements. Eric, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd just say, just to echo what Shaun said, because I think it's kind of bears repeating and it's important, is, yeah, in the early days, the efficacy was fairly low. And so manufacturers were really looking at just achieving light levels that were competitive with the incumbent light sources. In the past 5 years or so, we've started to get those high efficacies. And so now they're starting to look at optics that would maybe sacrifice efficacy a little. We're looking at color temperatures that might sacrifice a little bit on the efficacy because we already have a very efficacious product. So I think you'll start to see new product that will hit some of those things.
Thank you, guys. We also had a note mentioning, hey, you guys are mentioning NLC, the Network Lighting Control acronym. Someone saw slides mentioning luminaire level lighting control. And someone asked, hey, what are these terms? Are they the same thing? Are they different things? No, they are not the same thing. In fact, when we're talking about luminaire level lighting controls, that's what you know as in high level, your integrated sensor into a fixture. You can call your smart fixture. Three main components of a luminaire level lighting control. Number one is a motion sensor. Number two, a daylight sensor. And number three, the ability to be connected to a configuration tool, network lighting control system. And that just segues into the relationship. Luminaire level lighting controls are part of a network lighting control system. They can be a component of it, just like your discrete load controllers or your discrete sensors. And that is the relationship between those two. I do see a quick question by Andy Stromberg on who owns the data for LightFair and the IoT-enabled systems. Touching base, great question. It was not introduced in the seminar, but actually that is a very good thing to keep in mind as to these technologies being implemented. Who overall is going to own the information, and are there privacy implications? So great questions. We're going to keep our ears plugged to the ground on that.
So Matt Daly asks, any advancements on exterior sensors, specifically range and responsivity of motion sensors, or cheap options for retrofitting networked sensors? So there are a number of manufacturers that are looking at being able to utilize the existing NEMA 7-pin connectors on a lot of exterior lighting to essentially turn those into network nodes. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're looking for with respect to some of that. With respect to the actual sensors, several manufacturers do currently offer exterior rated sensors, but I'll tell you that that's probably something that's still largely being worked on to really come up with some of that stuff. Now, there are a couple of manufacturers that are working on radar-based sensor technology, particularly for exterior lighting, as well as potentially microwave. But that's kind of one of those things of we're still a little bit in the infancy there, I think. Somebody else may want to correct me on that, but the radar, I think, is the one that's most interesting to me because it was super cool, super small, and very, very responsive, the booth that I saw at LightFair. Anybody else want to add to that?
Oh, it's pretty solid.
There's a question that came in on 3D printing lighting fixtures at LightFair. If we saw anything that was 3D printed and how that's faring. I do remember some booths had some language around that, but I don't remember anything specific.
I'd say early days.
Early days.
There was actually a class very specifically at LightFair on 3D printing in the lighting industry. Unfortunately, was not able to attend it, but so there is interest. There were at least 2 or 3 different decorative products that I saw that were really interesting that had been 3D printed. And I know that there was some work being done, particularly with respect to optical systems and 3D printing. So it's definitely one of those things that is being looked at and starting to have an impact. Other questions?
Not seeing any more questions. We'll hang on for a couple more minutes to see if any more come in. Thank you all for joining.
Somebody's got to have another question.
Here's our contact info. Feel free to follow up if you have any more questions about what you heard here on this webinar about Lighting Design Lab, or about any help you need with projects you might be working on.
The recording.
We'll be making the recording of this webinar available. Give us a few days to get that file downloaded and cleaned up, and we'll be posting it on our website.
Well, from everyone here at the Lighting Design Lab and the Smart Building Center, thank you very much for joining us. Very excited to share, and please continue plugging in. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.